this is going to work.
It's live on Facebook now, but we're still having some problems on the professor's end. Can you hear us, Professor? We can see you. Oh, now he's on two parts, laptop and the phone.
Okay, I think we're back up again.
Hello, Professor. I think your cell phone is still logged into Zoom. We can see two feeds of you.
Yes, I'm going to turn that one off.
Excellent. Okay. Just in the nick of time, it looks like we're just going live on Facebook here. To our viewers, welcome back to Kyle Hooten Tonight, presented by Alpha News. Tonight, we are very fortunate to be joined by Professor H.W. Brands, who heads up the history department at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also a prolific author, a true historian, scholar of the American past, who has published over 35 books on various historical figures, the most recent of which is titled The Zealot and the Emancipator, John Brown, Abraham Lincoln, and the Struggle for American Freedom. We'll be discussing that work tonight. Professor, thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, Kyle. Glad to be with you.
So right off the bat, I think we should define exactly who John Brown is and why you chose to write about him. I think it's a name that many people are passingly familiar with as a folk hero or a controversial figure, but very few individuals actually know any details about him.
Yeah, so John Brown, in fact, in his own lifetime was utterly unknown until 1856. He was 56 years old, and he was suddenly wanted for murder in Kansas Territory. He was on the run, and he disappeared from public view, and then he became even better known, more notorious, following his raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia. He led a small band of about 24 men who tried to capture the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. They did, in fact, succeeding in capturing the arsenal, but their plan was to distribute weapons that were stored at the arsenal to enslave people in the vicinity, especially young men, slaves, who would then take up the weapons and fight for their freedom. In effect, John Brown was trying to start a violent insurrection of slaves. This is 1859, just on the eve of the Civil War. Now, of course, in 1859, nobody knew there was a civil war that was going to start in the next 2 years. But in fact, it was the actions of John Brown that helped trigger the Civil War. So John Brown, in his day, was known during this brief period, this 3-year period of his life. He was known, first of all, as somebody who was wanted for murder. He was an abolitionist, a violent abolitionist, and then someone who met his demise, or, depending on your point of view, became a martyr in consequence of this raid on Harper's Ferry. He was seen, certainly by white slave holders in the South, as a terrorist, someone who was trying to destroy their institution and perhaps destroy their lives in the bargain. He was seen by abolitionists in the North as a hero of the movement, somebody who was willing to put his convictions into practice, even at the cost of his life. Now, among anti-slavery groups, moderate anti-slavery groups, including among people like Abraham Lincoln, John Brown was seen as, first of all, a pain in the neck, and secondly, as a real threat to the continued functioning of the Union. Abraham Lincoln he's well known, of course. He's going to become president of the United States in 1861. He's going to get elected in 1860. And in fact, Lincoln in 1859, when John Brown led this raid on Harper's Ferry, had the inside track on the Republican nomination for president. And the arithmetic of the Electoral College at that time was such that essentially whoever got the Republican nomination, as long as it wasn't a screaming crazy, was going to be the next president of the United States. So Lincoln is trying to keep things under control. He's trying to sort of calm the fears of the South. He doesn't want the South to flee the Union immediately. He himself doesn't want to be seen as being anything at all akin to John Brown. Abraham Lincoln was opposed to slavery, especially opposed to the expansion of slavery. But he was not an abolitionist, a person who believed that slavery was so wrong, so evil, that basically any measures were justified to end slavery as soon as possible.
So you mentioned that John Brown's actions at Harper's Ferry played a critical role in triggering the Civil War. That's very interesting. I definitely want to talk about that. But first, I want to move back a little bit. What was the state of the abolitionist movement at the time of Harper's Ferry? Was this sort of a small niche idea, or did it have some broader acceptance?
Okay, I'll give you a little bit longer time frame. In 1776, the time of the Declaration of Independence, American independence, abolitionism was a very minor movement. Quakers, a few Baptists were opposed to slavery on moral grounds, but nearly everybody else, will exclude the slaves from this, presumably they didn't like it, but nearly everybody else figured it was just one of those necessities of life. It wasn't a great thing. People who weren't slaves didn't want to become slaves, but it was like sort of war and death and taxes and all that stuff. There are unpleasant things in life you can't avoid. Things changed gradually over the next 80 years. By 1800, the year in which John Brown was born, the northern states, by 1800, nearly all the northern states had ended slavery within their boundaries. In most cases, it was a phased emancipation. And so there were still slaves, legally held slaves in New York, for example, until the 1830s. But it was clear that opinion was shifting. Now, at the beginning, slavery was generally considered to be sort of a necessary evil. Necessary because certainly the southern states couldn't figure out how to run their economies without slavery. In time, the northern economies evolved in a way that no longer required or even recommended slavery. So northerners ended slavery within their own states. In the balance between necessary and evil, the necessary became less, and so the evil seemed to stand out more. Now, it's probably important to keep in mind in all this that the northern states did not end slavery through a fit of morality all of a sudden. They didn't, the scales didn't fall from the rise and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, we got to get rid of it. No, it's just that slavery no longer suited them. It was no longer necessary, so let's get rid of it. This is important because that's 1800. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison launches the first national abolitionist newspaper. It's called The Liberator. This is the beginning of the first coherent abolitionist political movement. The abolitionists before had mostly been these religious fringes. But in the 1830s, you get this political movement led by these abolitionists. These are people who contend that slavery is so wrong that essentially anything will be justified to end it. And this group represents a severe threat in some ways to the emerging democracy in the United States. It's not a coincidence that 1831, when The Liberator begins publication, this is in the first term of Andrew Jackson, who is the first democratically elected president. And the battle that takes place in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s is a battle in this emerging democracy. And the question is, how do you make change in a democracy? If the question had arisen in this form in the 1870s or 80s, folks would have turned to somebody like George Washington and say, George, tell us what to do. Because that was an age of deference. But in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, this is an age when basically everybody figures, not everybody, adult white males, they all figure they're equal politically and they have to be heard. And so as the abolitionist movement becomes louder, its opponents certainly said shriller, it focuses on the evils of slavery and it points the finger of guilt at Southerners. And saying, you guys should feel terrible about this. You're wrong, you're evil, you're sinners, you're going to go to hell for this. Not surprisingly, people in the South who are old enough to remember, it wasn't that long ago that Northerners held slaves too, they didn't take very kindly to this. And there developed sort of a backlash against the abolitionists. And this culminates in a speech given by John Calhoun, senator from South Carolina, who defends slavery as not simply a necessary evil, but a positive good. He says it stabilizes society, it helps civilize the Africans, and so on. So you get this growing moral divide. And what makes the moral divide so dangerous is that the moral divide is overlaid on top of this sectional divide. And so with both sections of the country looking at the other side as wrong, evil, then you get a situation where I'm certainly not going to say that a separation, a civil war is inevitable, but it became more and more likely as time went on.
Absolutely. So if I'm understanding you correctly, the North didn't abolish slavery out of moral sensibility. It simply fell away as part of their economy. And then this organized group that wants to abolish slavery as a moral imperative comes along, hops on top of what the North is already doing, which makes the South feel very threatened, correct?
That's essentially what I said, but I have to issue a corrective here. And that is that in everything in history, things are complicated.
Right.
And it's also important to remember that in a democracy like the United States, there is never a unified opinion on any issue of importance. And so the difference is, let's say in the state of New York, in 1790, 65% of the people think that slavery is okay. By 1810 in New York, 60% think that it's not worth it. And it's important because it really wasn't worth it. It was easy for the northern states to end slavery because there really wasn't much capital invested in them. You could basically free all the slaves in the North and hardly change anybody's mode of business operation. It hardly change anybody's style of life. If you were going to try to end slavery in a place like South Carolina or even Virginia, you're really going to turn the economy upside down. So it was a relatively inexpensive gesture for Northerners to say, okay, an end of slavery. But it's kind of like people who sometimes, I'm not gonna say every vegetarian, but when people become vegetarians for whatever reason, it's tempting then to buy into the moral argument for vegetarians. I don't want to pick on vegetarians, but you get the idea. If you no longer need to do this thing that some people consider to be wrong, then when you stop doing it, it's tempting to try to claim the moral high ground against those people who are still doing it. Now, so those are the abolitionists, but then there are people like Abraham Lincoln, who Lincoln was just as opposed to slavery in principle as John Brown. And Lincoln knew slavery better than John Brown did. John Brown was born in Connecticut, a free state. He grew up in Ohio, a free state. He lived all his life in free states and territories. Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky, a slave state. So he grew up around slaves, and he spent his adult life his teenage years in Indiana, just across the Ohio River from slave state Kentucky, and his adult life in Illinois. And so Lincoln had a better understanding of what the life of slaves was like. He also, and this is crucial to all of this stuff, Lincoln understood how complicated ending slavery would be. Again, not complicated in Massachusetts, where we're talking about maybe 0.5% to 1% of the population. But if you're talking about, as I say, South Carolina, where 50% of the population were enslaved peoples, you have to figure out not only how to free them, but what to do with them afterwards. And again, going back to this notion that this is an emerging democracy. If slaves had been freed in the 1770s, there would not have been an immediate demand or even a question raised, should they have political rights? Because most people didn't have political rights. Most white people didn't have political rights. Women certainly didn't have political rights. But in the age of democracy, you have to start thinking, okay, if the slaves are going to be freed, how are we going to integrate them into the political system? And so Lincoln believed that slavery was wrong, but unlike John Brown, who was willing in his conscience and then with his actions to override the rule of law, override the Constitution, Lincoln revered the Constitution. Lincoln believed that the Union was necessary for democracy. Again, I keep harping on this, but it's really important. We live in a time, in the year 2021, where American democracy has been around now for 2 centuries. It seems to work, it's relatively stable. But if you lived in the 1830s or 40s or 50s even, you'd have serious doubts whether there was a long-term future for democracy, because there weren't other democracies in the world. And American democracy was no older than you were, and it seemed as though democracy was under constant challenge. So Lincoln took the position that the Constitution has to hold firm, because the Constitution is the guarantor of the freedoms such as we have for everybody. Destroy the Constitution, destroy the Union, you will have demonstrated that people cannot govern themselves. And if people cannot govern themselves, then the whole basis for democracy evaporates.
Yeah, a bit of a tangential question, but I've always wondered it. Without the Civil War, how do you think the South would have gone about the slavery question, given these severe economic barriers to abolition?
So this is the imponderable question, and it gets at the question I'm often asked, since I wrote this book about John Brown and Abraham Lincoln. So how are we supposed to think about John Brown and Abraham Lincoln? And how you think about those two, especially John Brown, depends on your assessment of whether the Civil War was inevitable, or whether the Civil War was necessary to end slavery. Because, in fact, it's a very dramatic moment. It becomes dramatic sort of after the fact. When John Brown was being led from his jail cell to the scaffold to be hanged, he had been convicted of treason against Virginia and murder in the deaths of several people in his raid at Harper's Ferry. He smuggled a note to his jailer in which he said, "The sins of this evil country will not be purged away except by blood." Okay, so John Brown appears to be predicting a civil war.
Absolutely.
This is 1859. And as I suggested earlier, John Brown's actions made a civil war more likely. Didn't trigger the Civil War directly, but it made it more likely because it deepened that growing divide between North and South. So, but if you think that John Brown was right, that only a civil war would end slavery, then it's easier to think John Brown was something of a hero. Even his critics acknowledged that John Brown was brave. He put his life on the line. He eventually gave his life for the thing he believed in. But what was he doing? Well, I just mentioned this in passing in Kansas. Kansas was a territory, and settlers from the north and from the south were both free to go in there. And so a small-scale guerrilla war broke out between the southern settlers and the northern settlers over the future of Kansas. Would it be a slave state or would it be a free state? John Brown went there with 4 of his adult sons. And they formed this guerrilla unit, a small guerrilla army. And John Brown led couple of his sons and a couple of other men on a midnight terrorist raid where they invaded a small hamlet, a small community of pro-slavery settlers. And Brown and his men dragged 5 of the men, the pro-slavery settlers, out of their beds in the middle of the night and brutally murdered them, hacked them to death with broadswords. It was certainly, by the parlance of our day, a clear-cut act of terrorism. He was sending a message. You pro-slavery people, if you come to Kansas, this will happen to you too.
Right.
So, I mean, this guy, John Brown, clearly has the blood of murder on his hands. And then he goes to Harper's Ferry and he tries to start a war. You know, this is not the sort of thing you want to recommend to a younger generation, unless you think that things have gone so far that the only recourse is armed violence. Now, Abraham Lincoln didn't buy into it, but Abraham Lincoln was living in the moment. Abraham Lincoln thought that slavery could be ended peacefully. Abraham Lincoln believed that slavery would be ended in the South the same way it had been ended in the North, by a vote of the legislatures and the people of the southern states. Just as Pennsylvania had ended slavery, Virginia would end slavery, because Virginians would sooner or later see that in a modern economy, what you need is a flexible workforce. And slavery is just the opposite. Slavery, you can't lay off slaves. You have to support them when they're sick, when they're injured, when they're old. It just comes with the territory. And so even if there had been no moral regeneration in the South, simple self-interest would have dictated to Southerners it's time to end slavery. But that wasn't allowed to happen, in part because of the actions of people like John Brown. Now, we can step back and we can say, well, okay, was the Civil War destined to happen? Was it ordained by God? Well, Abraham Lincoln at first, at the time of John Brown's raid, said, no, we can solve this peacefully. We must solve this peacefully. By the end of the Civil War, however, after 600,000 lives had been lost, Lincoln in his second inaugural address came pretty close to agreeing with John Brown. In his second inaugural address, he said that if every drop of blood drawn by the slaver's lash must be paid for with a drop of blood drawn by the sword, that might be the will of God. Now notice he was sort of bringing God into the picture. Don't blame me exactly. It's God's will. But he's getting pretty close to saying that the Civil War was inevitable. Now, you can't prove any counterfactuals in life, and certainly not in history. But I just put this out. In 1750, pretty much every country in the world allowed slavery. And almost no country in the world thought, big deal. It's just, okay, that's just the way life is. Right. By 1900, no country in the world, with a couple of exceptions, allowed slavery legally. And it's only in the United States of America, with the half exception of Haiti, where there was a nationalist uprising. It was only in the United States of America that this huge war, the Civil War was one of the biggest wars in the world in the 19th century, that was involved in ending slavery. So it seems that other people were able to figure out how to end slavery without tearing their country apart. Brazil, slavery in Brazil was entrenched. It was much worse, and what it inflicted on the slaves themselves. Even Brazil ended slavery peacefully. So if you think that slavery could have ended without a civil war, then you have to think, no, we don't need more John Browns. We don't want more John Browns. People who basically say, I am above the law, I know better, and this allows me to kill people. On the other hand, if you think, well, in fact, if we could talk to John Brown here, he would say the war had already started. It simply hadn't been declared yet. And so I was simply acting like a soldier at war. Now, the only problem with this is the only general that John Brown acknowledged was God. And once you bring God into the picture like that, there's no telling where things are going to go.
Absolutely. To our viewers who are just tuning in, we're on the line with Professor H.W. Brands talking about his newest book, The Zealot and the Emancipator, John Brown, Abraham Lincoln, and the Struggle for American Freedom. Professor, you just mentioned that John Brown derived his authority from God. Do historians have any indication of how John Brown arrived at his positions? Was it a religious thing? Because you said earlier that he didn't live in a slave territory. He didn't have, or he at least had limited experiences with slavery. So where did he derive his motivation?
John Brown lived among abolitionists from the time he was relatively young. By his own recollection, there were two moments that were kind of epiphanies for John Brown. One was when he was a boy, and he was living in Ohio. Ohio was a free state, but it was close enough to Kentucky that there were slaves in the vicinity, and he saw them in the marketplace, he saw them working in the fields, and so on. And John Brown recalled playing with another boy. John Brown's 8 or 10 years old. And this other boy, same age roughly, who happens to be black. And it turns out happens to be a slave. And they're playing until this white man, comes and grabs the black boy and starts yelling at him for not doing something or other, and so then starts beating him over the head. And John Brown remembered from middle age, all of a sudden I realized, said John Brown, that this boy's world was very different from mine. Nobody could do that to me except possibly my father. But and so John Brown said, I remember that, I knew somehow deep in my boy's heart that slavery was wrong. A second moment occurred when John Brown was 37 years old. He was living in Hudson, Ohio at this point. Hudson was really a hotbed of abolitionism. And news came that an abolitionist editor, a man named Elijah Lovejoy, had been murdered by a pro-slavery mob in Illinois, in Alton, Illinois, just across the Mississippi River from slave state Missouri. And John Brown said, boy, the term that abolitionists often use regarding the South was the slave power. And I realized that the slave power was getting out of control. If it could reach into free territory to Illinois and murder someone just for expressing opinions, well, that was way too much. And on the day that John Brown heard this news, he stood up in his church in Hudson, Ohio, and he said, here before the eyes of God, before the eyes of my congregation, I pledge the rest of my life to the struggle against slavery. So John Brown didn't read his Bible and conclude from the Bible that slavery is wrong. In fact, you have a hard time concluding from the Bible that slavery is wrong. Right. And lots of apparently sincere ministers in the South read their Bible and say that slavery is right. But I think the way to read it is that John Brown concluded from his observations of the world and his own sort of sensibility of what was right, that slavery was wrong. Once having come to that conclusion, then he could selectively read his Bible and say, okay, we must love our neighbor, we must treat our neighbor like ourselves, and so on. So in John Brown's case, it's not the religious beliefs that give rise to the abolitionism, but the abolitionism which arises from other sources and is then reinforced by John Brown's interpretation of the Bible and of religion.
That makes a lot of sense. How would John Brown have regarded Abraham Lincoln? Would he have seen him as an ally, a lukewarm ally, an enemy?
So as is often the case in religious and political movements. And the abolitionist movement was semi-religious and semi-political, somewhere between the two. Often it's the smallest differences that provoke the greatest enmity. Yep. So John Brown would have said, John Calhoun was dead by this time, but we'll call him a spokesman for the slave of power. Mm-hmm. John Brown would have considered him sort of an open
I don't know if it's just me that's having connectivity issues or if it's everybody, but bear with us, please.
Condemnation.
We had a bit of a connectivity issue there. I'm pretty sure the audience heard what you said, but I kind of missed the last little bit there, but I got the gist of it. Was Abraham Lincoln aware of John Brown before the raid at Harper's Ferry?
Yes. So nobody was aware of John Brown outside of his family. He was a big family. He had 20 children.
That's a lot of people. Wow. That's a lot of people.
Yeah. So he had a built-in audience. But nobody was aware of John Brown until 1856, when he led this murderous raid on Potawatomi in Kansas. And then he was known of, but not very many people knew him. He still circulated in abolitionist circles.
Was he a fugitive at that time after the incident?
Exactly.
Okay.
But it was fortunate for him that this was just before photography becomes a common thing. So there were no photographs of John Brown on the post offices, no wanted posters. He was wanted, there were written descriptions, but John Brown in writing looks like a lot of people. He cut his hair and grow his beard and change his name and he can circulate. And John Brown was also, it's striking about John Brown. He convinced many people that he was the most sincere, the most upright person they had ever met. But he was also really good at dissimulation. He could disguise himself. He could pretend he's somebody else. He could say things that were simply false and get other people to believe him. But he really was a charismatic figure. So Lincoln, 3-year period between 1856 and 1859. When the raid on Harper's Ferry began, in fact, nobody knew right off who was leading this raid. But gradually that part was figured out when somebody recognized him. And so this is John Brown. And at that point, Abraham Lincoln goes out of his way to say, John Brown, Lincoln was now a member of the new Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln said, John Brown is not a Republican. I don't believe what John Brown believes. John Brown despises the Constitution. I believe in the Constitution. I mentioned William Roy Garrison a while back. William Roy Garrison was one of the most outspoken editors in the abolitionist movement. And he made a big deal of publicly burning his copy of the Constitution because he said that, a Constitution is a document that guarantees the existence of slavery, is a Constitution we cannot live under. And strikingly, Garrison and some other abolitionists in the 1850s said that the North should secede from the South because the abolitionists like Garrison didn't want to feel the guilt that went along with being in the same country as the Southerners. Garrison did not explain what good this was going to do for the slaves, because at least if they were still part of this union, then the Constitution gave them some hope of the future, but it was kind of in the way of thinking of the abolitionists.
Very interesting, very interesting. This may be broaching on, away from historical fact and into opinion, but what do you make of the modern understanding of John Brown? Is he a folk hero or a terrorist?
I would say that John Brown is more likely to be embraced as a hero, someone who was on the right side of history. Mm-hmm. And you can't gainsay that, because John Brown was right in believing that slavery was wrong, and he was just ahead of some other people in the country. And we live at a time when no one in the world is willing to stand up and say slavery is right. No, and good thing. Slavery was this horrible institution. And so a lot of people say, boy, John Brown was brave. He gave his life to his cause. Maybe he jumped the gun a little bit, but the Civil War was coming. 700,000 people are going to die. So what's 5 more in Kansas and maybe roughly the same number in Harper's Ferry? If, as John Brown believed, and a lot of people agree with this, that somehow the Civil War was inevitable. and it was necessary to end slavery. So if you believe that, then the deaths that John Brown was involved in ahead of the Civil War, they pretty much pale by comparison, because John Brown, you could say, gave the country the nudge necessary to end slavery. But again, on the other hand, that's making a big assumption that the Civil War was inevitable or was necessary to end slavery. And so
Right.
I'll say one other thing, that there has long been a strain of thinking about John Brown. That John Brown was sometimes crazy. He was often called Crazy John Brown. And it was convenient at the time for people in both the North and the South to call John Brown crazy. So if you were a Southerner, you weren't willing to acknowledge that John Brown might have been right in any of this. No, John Brown's crazy. And if you're somebody like Lincoln, you don't want to acknowledge that maybe the same beliefs that your fellow Republicans have lead to this kind of thing, because that was exactly the argument that Southerners were making against the Republican Party. They universally called them Black Republicans, and they used the term Black in two senses, because they supported Black people, but also because their Black hearts were turned against the South and its rights under the Constitution. This was the argument the Southerners made. Now, was John Brown crazy? I'm quite happy to say no, he wasn't crazy. If crazy means that you're out of touch with reality, if you don't understand the consequences of your actions and you're operating on delusions. John Brown was not deluded at all. He didn't think that freeing the slaves was going to be easy. He did, though, he came to a position finally, well, basically a position of a martyr. Now, if you believe that martyrs, which a martyr is in some ways, at least in a case like John Brown, where he walked into his martyrdom, maybe a suicide, then you must be mildly off your rocker to do that, because your attachment to this world is not strong enough or something. But John Brown was fully aware of what he was doing, and there's a crucial point in all this story where John Brown, who for most of his life, from the time he takes up arms, from the time he gives that pledge to fight against slavery in that church in Ohio, until basically Harper's Ferry, from 1837 to 1859, for 22 years, John Brown believes that he is going to be worth something important to the abolitionist movement alive by what he does in life. But once he gets arrested, once he gets on trial, you can see an evolution in his thinking in the letters that he writes to his wife and other people. He realizes all of a sudden he's going to be of greater value to the abolitionist movement dead than alive. And so he embraces this new calling. And Brown himself, as far as I can tell, doesn't liken himself to Jesus, the sacrificial gift for his cause. That would be blasphemy on his part. But in pulpits in the North, among abolitionists in the North, upon his death, he was often likened to Jesus, the man who gave his life for the salvation, in this case, of his country.
That also strengthens the cause that he's not crazy, because that's a great deal of introspection for a crazy person to have, to look at their own life and fit themselves into the context of current events and understand how those will be reviewed by historians. That really doesn't seem like the actions of a crazy man.
Right, exactly. Although I will say this, from a literary and dramatic standpoint, it sometimes makes a better story if John Brown is sort of mildly off his rocker. And so there was a show on, I guess, Showtime, TV show, series that came out actually just about the time my book came out, starring Ethan Hawke. And I was often asked, so is that a good portrayal of John Brown? And I confess, well, it's based on a book called The Good Lord Bird by James McBride. And I say, I actually don't know, I haven't watched the show. And I've read a few snippets of the book, but I have an excuse for this. And that is, when I'm writing a nonfiction version of something, I deliberately avoid reading the fictional stuff. Because in fact, if it's a compelling work of fiction, I'm likely to remember some of the things out of the book, but I won't remember that James McBride made them up. And they'll slip into my own book and say, that's not what I want.
Yeah, it must be difficult to be a historian in an era where these pop depictions of historical figures are so prevalent. I've never considered that before.
Well, I will say this. So I teach at the University of Texas, and with my students, I often have them watch a movie based on some chapter in history, and then read the historical account and ask them, what they make of it. And I'll be the first to acknowledge that a movie director has different purposes than a historian or biographer, because the movies are going to be judged on dramatic effect. People are not going to write PhD theses attempting to portray what actually happened based on a movie. You can't footnote a movie and defend that in your dissertation defense. So everybody knows that. On the other hand, there's a certain, I think there's a certain responsibility, or there should be a certain responsibility, if you're going to take literary or dramatic or cinematic license with somebody. If you're going to call them by their name, if you're going to call this person John Brown, you don't get to just make things up, but people do. Oliver Stone's a good example. Somebody who just makes it up and calls it JFK. And I know his movie on JFK is one that I've had to spend years explaining to students. No, it didn't happen like that. LBJ did not assassinate John Kennedy.
That's a funny mental picture. This esteemed professor at the front of a lecture hall explaining that LBJ did not kill President Kennedy.
So I have question time in my lectures, and students get to ask anything they want. And this is the kind of thing that comes up.
Yeah, absolutely. Jumping a little bit into the political, I know there's a lot of different groups that use the John Brown name. They invoke John Brown to sometimes name their political movements. There's the John Brown Gun Club, which is sort of a left-wing, I don't want to say Antifa, but maybe Antifa adjacent organization. Do you feel that these portrayals of John Brown in modern activist groups are fair, or is it sort of bastardizing his spirit?
Well, since John Brown is dead and really is no position to complain, to me, the greater question is, does this lend a legitimate or a spurious renown on these groups? Sure. And I would say that in the case of John Brown, be really careful attaching your movement to John Brown, because at the heart of what John Brown was doing, he was basically saying that my personal beliefs matter more than the laws of this country, and that I can take the lives of other people who've done me no direct harm because I believe that they or somebody like them is engaged in this wrong action. And I don't know, maybe in the sort of the cosmic scale, maybe when we die and go to the pearly gates and St. Peter is judging us, well, I'll leave that to St. Peter. But if you're going to try to run a democracy, one of the basic rules is you don't get to take the law into your own hands, because then there's no drawing a line. This is exactly what terrorists do. Terrorists believe in the sincerity of their movement. They believe that they're doing the right thing. Now, everybody else thinks they're doing the wrong thing and they're murdering people. Well, that's exactly where John Brown was. Now, again, because John Brown turned out to be on the right side of history, then, okay, some people are say, well, boy, if I'd been alive, I'd be right at John Brown's side. You know, maybe, maybe not. But because in the present, we don't know. We don't know. We're before the Civil War. The Civil War hasn't happened yet. And until it does, I don't think individuals have any right to do things that are going to bring it on. I certainly hope that there aren't people out there, you know, whether they're named in a John Brown gun club or something else, who are trying to bring the Civil War on. Because, you know, whatever you think of the positive outcomes of the Civil War, the end of slavery, which is certainly a plus, how do you balance that against 650, 700,000 lives lost? You know, that's not a balance, a calculation for us to make.
Right. Looking back, you can see that some historic events may or may not have been inevitable, but when you're in the present, it's very difficult to predict what needs to be done, what's inevitable, what costs are justified. It's impossible to do.
Yeah, so one of the things that I say is the people in my business, we historians, we're not any wiser than anybody else about what's going to happen tomorrow. But the day after tomorrow, once we know what happened tomorrow, we're the ones who will tell you why that thing that happened tomorrow was inevitable. So,
right. Funny, but also very wise. You know, you can't predict the future, but you can definitely explain events as they transpire.
But it's really important, though. It's really important when you explain those things, and often there's simply not time to do this, to remind yourself that it didn't have to turn out this way. It's almost ingrained in what historians do, to explain the things that did happen and look at all the pointers that point to make this thing happen. But remember that no, it could have happened another way. And it's especially when you're trying to translate the lessons of history to the present, because, you know, it's kind of easy predicting from the vantage of 2021. It's pretty easy predicting that John Brown's raid is going to lead to the Civil War in 1861, because we know it already happened. But we don't know what anything that happens today is going to lead to 5 years from now.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the last questions I have for you here, just being mindful of our time, is just about history more broadly. It seems like there's been a renewed public interest in studying history through a very critical lens and assessing the virtue and value of different American historical figures. What do you make of this sort of popular interest in history? Do you think that it's going in a constructive direction? Do you think people are well intentioned? I guess it's kind of an open-ended question, but what do you make of this? Because it's ended with, statues being defaced and, various reputations of historical events and figures being altered drastically.
Well, the first thing that I would say is, I mean, some things say, well, should San Francisco change the name of a school that's named for Abraham Lincoln? Should it put a new name on there? And my answer to this is, I don't live in San Francisco. I didn't vote for the school board. What San Francisco wants to do is up to San Francisco.
Fair enough.
So anybody sort of beyond the place where I live and I get to vote, I don't have any say in it. However, I will say this, though, that it is my perception of a lot of this, that it is driven not by any particular interest in history. It's driven by current day politics. And so, and these things are basically judged on how does it play in politics today. To use this example, I think actually the San Francisco School Board rescinded its decision. But the question essentially became, was Abraham Lincoln fit to be essentially elected to the San Francisco School Board in 2020? And the answer is, well, probably not. But he didn't live in 2020. He was elected in 1860. So if there is a single lesson that history teaches, as far as I'm concerned, or should teach, it's that the past, just like the present, is complicated. And the people who are looking to the past for lessons, or so do we take this statue down? Do we change the name of this? They really sort of want simple answers to questions today because they're scoring political points. My general feeling is that, again, being a teacher of history, I am really nervous when anything that represents the past is removed, because Americans, not uniquely in the world, but Americans know precious little about our past. And when you start removing connections to the past, then you've lost statues, for example. They're a sort of public education. So I'll share with this group. I teach at the University of Texas, and there were statues to various Confederate, some of them were heroes. Robert E. Lee was one, and other people from Texas just served in the Civil War. And so the question came to the president of the university: do you leave the statues up? Do you take them down? And I wrote an unsolicited piece of advice to the president of the university. And I said, leave the statues up, but just go around and to each one that doesn't already have it, affix a small notice, the year in which this statue was erected. Because there is this idea that sort of if this thing exists in the world today, we're responsible for it. No, right. If the statue went up in 1929, let the world know that the statue went up in 1929. And then people coming along in 2020, they don't have to say, well, why'd you put the statue up? We didn't. It's been there for a century. Because, I mean, I'll use the example again on my campus, the University of Texas. So we used to have these statues of these people who were involved in the Civil War. Now we still have statues of Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez and Barbara Jordan, Congresswoman from Texas. Mm-hmm. And as long as the Confederate statues were still there, I thought, boy, this is a great educational opportunity. And this was the whole idea behind putting the dates on. So in the 1920s, the people who ran the University of Texas thought it was appropriate to commemorate Confederate heroes. In the 1990s, the people who ran the University of Texas thought it was important to commemorate Martin Luther King. Now there is a trajectory, there's some history there. But now we have the statues of the modern folks and none of the older folks. And so there's no perspective on how this came about. So in general, I'd say leave stuff up and deal with it and educate people, and just remember that not everything that our ancestors did is something we should be proud of. Just as this is an exercise I do with my classes, we're certainly doing things today that our grandchildren are going to be appalled by. And so keep this in mind.
That is a nuanced position I haven't heard people take before. Not only do the statues commemorate our own history, but they commemorate our evolving understanding of the history with reference to the time that the statues were erected. I agree with that position. It's very convincing indeed. If our viewers want to become better informed students of history and they want to read your books, especially your newest one, which is titled The Zealot and the Emancipator, John Brown, Abraham Lincoln, and the Struggle for American Freedom, where can they find your works?
Well, you certainly can find them online at Penguin Random House, my publisher. There, you buy them there. You can buy it on Amazon. In bookstores, if you can get into the bookstores that are open, they usually have copies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Professor, thank you so much for being with us. To our audience, thanks for tuning in again. God bless and good evening.
Great to talk to you, Kyle. See you.